In this episode of the Colorist Podcast, we take a look back at all the guests we've had in 2017. So much has happened this past year in the world of the colorist. Blackmagic unveiled 2 new affordable panels, as well as releasing Resolve 14. Filmlight continues to innovate and shipped version 5 of Baselight. UHD and HDR are also gaining wide adoption, with new content being available every day. I recently had the opportunity to go back and review every podcast from this last year. I couldn't believe all the talented people that made the time to sit and talk with me. Colorists that worked on films from Lord of the Rings to Saving Private Ryan, TV shows like NCIS Los Angeles and Planet Earth 2, and commercials for Coca-Cola and Levi's. We delved into many different topics like collaborating with DPs, working in foreign countries, and emerging technologies like HDR. This podcast would not be possible without the generous support of the Colorist Society and Mixing Light. Together, we're all interested in bringing more attention to the work we do as colorists, and I want to thank them for everything they've done for the podcast. Also, I want to thank you. Everyone who listens to the podcast, likes us on Facebook, and engages in thoughtful conversations. It all inspires me to do even more with this podcast. It's grown larger and faster than I could ever imagine, so thank you for listening. So sit back, grab a cocoa, coffee, or scotch, and let's reflect on 2017. First up is Peter Doyle. He's most known for his work on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. However, he's been involved in projects at various different budgets. And in this section, he talks about working on films that vary both visually and conceptually. The kinds of films that you've worked on are so vastly different. As you had said, you'd worked on Lord of the Rings, but you've also done movies like Big Eyes and Inside Llewellyn Davis, and most people would be really surprised that the same colorist had worked on all 3 of those projects. Does your approach change based on the different style of these films?
No. There's certain practical decisions. Certainly Inside Llewellyn Davis was Joel and Ethan. It was pretty much an indie film, so the budgets are a little more limited. In some ways, the approach changes. The cold reality is that budgets will dictate to an extent the approach. Then the second is that the relationship is a little different because it's always like a 3-way conversation between the DP, the director, and the colorist. So that kind of relationship and how that evolves can change. Directors are human beings, surprisingly, and so they're just different people. So that there's just a different dynamic involved. So I guess that's a very long-winded way to answer the question, which I guess I could have answered in that the approach changes not so much in process, but really in terms of reference and the evolution of the particular look or style of the film. And that becomes very dependent on the director and the little world that the director has. So, if you think of each film as really its own little kingdom, and, if you're working with the Wachowskis or the Coens or Peter Jackson or Tim Burton, they have their own, it really is their own little world, and that they will work with their team, specifically their production designer, their conceptual artist, and their DP. So you're really coming into a particular family. So the dynamics is very different, obviously, with each kind of group unto itself. The objective is the same, which is a film that reflects the creative intent of everyone involved. But that process tends to be a little different. So it's different in perhaps the references and how you go about trying to find the looks involved. So somebody like Tim Burton and the way you would, at least I go about finding specific looks for those films, it's quite a different process to something like the Coen brothers, which again is quite a different process to David Yates from Fantastic Beasts. So that's perhaps what changes. The process itself is, we're still making 2K DCPs and we're still using software and we still use cameras. So that side of it's kind of the same. Interestingly, I found that the big change is actually the language, just the actual verbal, the language and the references and frankly the assumptions of the understanding and the references changes.
Next, I talked with Dave Abrams, calibration specialist and founder of Avical. In our highly technical discussions, we talked a lot about HDR. Here's what he had to say about the future of monitor calibration. How is HDR changing the way that you do calibrations?
HDR is an entirely new target. We have our Rec 709 HD target, we have our Rec 2020 Ultra HD target, and now we have our HDR target. And as you may know, it uses a different target. We wouldn't really call it gamma anymore, but what we used to refer to as gamma, we now refer to as most often, I think, the electro-optical transfer function, or the EOTF. And so we're targeting a whole different system, and it's actually fallen into place faster than I expected. What happens in HDR is as you are, in the electro-optical transfer function, it's sort of dynamic based on the display and the display's capabilities. So for example, you could master at 1,000 nits, you can master at 4,000 nits. Now let's say you have a display like the Dolby that you mastered something at 4,000 nits at, and you have in the data, the info frame data, and some people refer to as metadata, but some people will tell you that's incorrect. You'd have this data that says, hey, this was mastered at 4,000 nits, and the display can only do 1,000 nits. So the display would then look at that and actually do tone mapping, where it'll roll it off. And the roll off is, to my understanding today, it's sort of the Wild West. So the manufacturers will roll off based on the capability of their display because they know the capability of their display, right? So to make a standard that says, well, we're going to roll off this here and that there doesn't necessarily work if, an LG OLED can do 700 nits and a Samsung can do 1,200 nits and a Sony can do 1,500 nits, let's say. The roll off should be different there because they have different capabilities. And so in mastering the content, just to be clear, we don't roll off. In mastering the content, we master the content like a colorist like yourself is going to master the content and work within whatever the display is capable of. Now, the display is capable of 1,000 nits. You're working at 1,000 nits. You then put that data into your master, into your encode, and when it plays back, the display then says, oh, this is 1,000 nits. Well, I'm only capable of 700 nits. So I'm going to roll off from wherever the manufacturer sort of decides, let's say 500 nits to 700 nits, and they start rolling off to try and compress the extra 300 nits of brightness of luminance that are in that image into that space so that you're not hard clipping. You're not clipping stuff that should be in the image, but you're trying to make it fit within what you can do. The beauty of that is, let's say you buy a better TV a couple years down the road that can do 1,000 nits. Well, now you rewatch your movie and you go, wow, this movie actually looks better. It looks better because now I'm not having to roll off. I'm able to get more of that brightness. I'm getting more of what the original intent of that content was. The electro-optical transfer function for HDR, the PQ curve that people would refer to as, that is sort of fixed in production, but then it sort of changes in the consumer, in reproduction, let's say. It is a living, breathing thing, HDR, and it does make it a little more difficult. But at first, we're sort of, well, what are we supposed to target? Because we can't hit Rec 2020. Not really any displays hit Rec 2020. So do I target Rec 2020? And, the industry very quickly said, you know what? Rec 2020 is a container. We can go up to Rec 2020 really within the system. And right now, we'll just fill that container with what we can fill it with. And it's sort of become best practice to work in the P3, D65 color space targets. But it's not necessarily the limitation, right? So if you have a display that can hit P3, you target P3, and then you put in your encode, you put this data in there, and then the TV knows, oh, red is this red, right? And then the calibration of the display, you calibrate the display to a target, and then the display then remaps within that. So I can calibrate the display to a target, and I can even calibrate a display in HDR targeting a consumer display, a reproduction display, let's say, not a broadcast display, to P3. But if it goes beyond P3, it's still okay because I'm just getting it so that the scale is right. And so once this red is where this red should be, then you're hoping the other red where that red should be is there, even if, do you know what I mean? So it's going to move around. So you basically map the display and say the display is mapped properly. And then if you have less data, it's going to map it. And if you have more data, it's going to map it. But the display is mapped properly and it's hitting the standard as close as it should hit the standard. And then as titles come out with more information, it'll take advantage of that information if it can. And if it can't take advantage of that information, it's going to try to do tone mapping to then make it so that that information looks as good as it possibly can on that display. And that's sort of the beauty of it. Whereas Rec 709 and even Rec 2020, they were built more as fixed systems. We had Rec 709 and this was the red of Rec 709, this was the green, and that was the blue. And if you couldn't quite do it, you couldn't quite do it. and that's what it was. And we didn't really remap to anything, and of course some things might have been mastered on something that wasn't quite capable and then be played back as Rec 709, maybe look a little more saturated than it originally did because it was mastered on a Rec 601 SIMP-DC monitor and vice versa, so we kind of had that. But with HDR, they've really tried to make the people who have architected have really tried to make it very dynamic and say, okay, well, as technology gets better, we're going to grow into this technology. And as mastering technology gets better, there'll be more information there. And then your display will take advantage of it as it can. So in terms of calibration, we kind of target the standard, right? And that standard will be dependent on the capability of the display. And the display is just going to roll with it from there to then take the data and read the information. Of course, the caveat is if you have bad information on your disk, then, if the master is, that wasn't set up properly, there was no color gamut target, color space of mastering put on the disk itself, then, the display has to interpret and then you might get further errors. But in broadcast, we kind of try to do as much as we can to get as close to that target. We hard clip it and then we just take that information and put it within the master.
Warren Eagles is the first person that introduced me to the DaVinci 2K. It was my first step into understanding the art of color grading. Since he had a long career in telecine, we talked about film stocks and how they relate to digital cameras today. I've often heard you make the connection between codecs and cameras and the selection of film stocks too. So why, when you did telecine, why did people favor one film stock over another?
Well, back to a story. There was a colorist who was a big name in London. I'm talking like late 80s, Jim Hogan. Sadly, he's not with us anymore. But he was one of those legend colorists, larger-than-life guy, and he had a lot of big clients. He did a lot of work. And I'd always just try and grab time with him, or if we were having a beer somewhere. And one of the things he said to me, he said, you can learn the software, and it's obviously very important, but really get to learn your film stocks. Learn what they are like, the characteristics of them, how they behave on your machine, and he said that will really stand you in good stead. And so I always did, and I took time out to talk to DPs. The biggest differences were that Kodak or Fuji, from a negative point of view, definitely did have a different feel. And some DPs will obviously change depending on what they needed and the look they wanted. Kodak was always a little bit warmer than the Fuji. Fuji had to have a slightly more subtle, almost slightly more bluey green feel. And then obviously your stocks were rated differently as to their speed, whether you needed faster stock to use later in the day.
And that's why people sometimes say Arri today looks different than Sony, looks different than Red.
Yes. One of the things people say to me, I have trouble making it look filmic. And back to the question on grading film, I think because I colored so much film, I got so used to looking at it, I think that definitely stands in good stead when you're grading digital, because sometimes it's hard to explain what you do to an image. And you may have heard this from other colorists, especially if you're using a panel. And people say to me, son, what did you just do there? And I say, well, I just do it because I probably so many years of just looking at an image and knowing what I want to do. that's with a panel as well. You know, you can adjust 2 or 3 things at the same time and you really get more of a feel for the image. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. It's an instinct. It's something that you do without thinking.
Yeah, you're like me. Sometimes probably you work on different types of panels. But I always say, you know, any panel is going to be better than just grading on a mouse for speed, because you can just do things. And if you are having to offer up different looks for a client, you can certainly achieve more of those with the panel faster and offer them up different things that they might like and they like to choose.
In this next interview segment, the legendary Bob Festa shares some of his insights on how he works with clients and keeps them coming back to his suite. Yeah, it is one of the most interactive jobs, whether we're talking about color or mixing or any of that stuff. We have to get our clients involved in the session. Is there anything that you do to keep it flowing? Like there's sometimes gaps or problems in a session, but how do you keep that vibe going?
Let me tell you about my process. Generally, the first thing when I work with somebody new or even an existing client, I have them sit down at the client console, and opposed to me being in front of them in the studio, which is a traditional layout, I actually go back behind them and I sit on the couch, on the client couch, and I kind of flip the relationship a little bit. You know, and I ask them about their hopes and their dreams and their expectations for the piece we're going to be working on, whether it's a 30-second spot, a doc, a TV show, or a clip. It really kind of flips the egg where it kind of puts them in the leadership position and puts me back in a collaboration position. So we might talk about some of the stuff on the web they liked. Maybe they brought in a piece of print they're really fond of. Needless to say, we'll talk about some of the general ideas as far as where we want to push this. Is it going to be beauty? Is it going to be dirty? You know, I get some pretty general ideas about that. Kind of talk to them, let them know that I'm going to show them so many things their head is going to spin off. And then I head down into the pit and into my chair. And the first thing I do is I whip up 9 quick looks just to get a broad stroke and a theme about what we just talked about. And I had a lot of Baselight experience, so I'm very familiar with show versions, which is a great, great tool. So I would load 9 different things up into the gallery and then show them those 9 things. Now, the Resolve doesn't really do that natively, but I do have a method where I can actually show 9 different gallery grades or gallery stills up using the split screen feature. But anyway, once you show somebody 9 different things straight up on the first thing we talked about, you put those 9 cubes up there and you push play, you can walk away for 20 minutes and let these guys just completely take in what you've just shown them. And even though some of the differences might be very, very minute and minuscule, maybe one slightly warmer, maybe one slightly cooler, I mean, once you show somebody 9 different exposures, I mean, it's just fantastic. You've got them. They're a client for life.
Many of us learned some of our best techniques from the books and manuals written by Alexis Van Herkman. He has some great ideas about how directors, cinematographers, and colorists will all change their techniques when working with projects that deliver in HDR. We were talking earlier, too, before we started podcasting about HDR and your experience with it. Obviously, it's one of the biggest changes that we've had, with color and technology that's changing rapidly. It gives us the ability to make more contrast of luminance or color or saturation. Do you believe that this is going to change the way cinematographers and colorists approach these projects?
That's an interesting question, because I've moved into the camp of those who say that I think you will get a better result from your grade if you spend time thinking about and designing for HDR in your art direction and in your cinematography. So I absolutely believe that that is true. However, I don't think it necessarily requires you to think differently about those things. I think the main thing is you just have to think about highlights in more detail. It's something you need to develop a bit more language for, if that makes sense. And in other words, in Rec 709 and even in P3, which gives you a little bit more, we're familiar with the range of luminance that's available to us, right? And all of the highlights occupy this relatively thin band. relative to the rest of the image. And we've all just gotten used to that, right? Where are the highlights? Well, they're like 90 to 100%. Where are the peak highlights? Well, they're like 95 to 100%, right? There's not a huge difference between a peak highlight and diffuse white, if you will. Depending on how you grade. Some colorists like to move diffuse white a little lower so the peak whites have a little more pop. Other colorists or other situations, rather, require brighter diffuse white so that the whole image can have a little more oomph to it, which means that there's less of a delta between diffuse white and your peak whites. But, either way, you're talking about, maybe if you're really, really going for a murky, shadowy kind of thing, you're going to move diffuse white to what? Maybe down to 75% because you're going all 7 on the grade, right? The difference between all those situations is not that great, really. It seems greater than it is because we're used to perceiving a bigger change than is really there, just because we know how little there is. But moving into the realm of HDR, all of a sudden, you're not just talking about the difference between diffuse white and peak white, right? You're talking about the difference between diffuse white and, say, ordinary highlights and intense highlights and then specular highlights, right? And all those different kinds of highlights can be at different levels. Whereas before, this whole range of different kinds of highlights were smushed into 5% of the video signal or 10% of the video signal, right? You really weren't differentiating that finely between, say 5 kinds of highlights. You were really talking about 2 kinds of highlights, the bright ones and the really bright ones. Well, now you can have the bright ones, the more bright, the even brighter, the very bright, and then the extremely bright. And you can use that if you've prepared for that. Or rather, it's easier to use that if you've prepared for that. Because my experience grading either pre-graded masters to put them into an HDR look, or grading stuff that was just shot conventionally. The intention was to grade it to 709 or whatever. So no special care was taken with the highlights. Is that oftentimes you find yourself having to create your own managed highlights. In other words, the brightest thing in the picture often is not the thing you want audiences to be looking at, right? Which is the guy's face. No, it's the window behind the guy. And so if you just stretch the signal naturally, well, now you've got this bright window and everyone's looking at the bird outside instead of looking at the guy who's holding the knife. Because nobody thought to put a highlight on the knife because they thought, we want it to be in the midtones. That'll be fine. Well, yeah, now no one's looking at the knife. They're looking at the bird out the window. Whereas if we've got this opportunity to put these highlights at different levels. So maybe we want the knife to be the brightest highlight. And we want his face or the rim light on his face coming from the window to be the next brightest thing. And then we want the window to be bright, but not the brightest thing. So you're going to make different decisions. Maybe you're going to care a little bit more about throwing some ND over the window in your lighting scheme. Maybe you're going to go ahead and put a little inky on that knife. And maybe you're going to sculpt the lighting on his face a little differently because now you don't care about cigarette burns on his face so much because you know that HDR is going to be able to hold more saturation in those highlights. So you're not going to lose skin tone just because you want a hard rim light on his face. And to anyone who says, we don't like hard lights on faces, I'm like, go out go on a picnic and look at your friends and tell me what you see. Because there's plenty of hard light on faces out in the world. And if you go to an art gallery, you're going to see tons of hard highlights on faces. It's something you can do. And the reason we haven't had it on the menu is because that doesn't necessarily look that great in 709. But now we have an opportunity to finally combine brighter than ordinary highlights with saturation and have a really nice, pleasing integration of those areas of the picture into everything else, rather than, oh God, this is, hard and clipped and it's going to be a little jagged. It's like, no, it'll be just as smooth as everything else because that saturation is allowable.
What I'm getting from what you're saying, though, is that they can plan for a hierarchy of brightness to kind of define where your eye should be drawn. Does that sound about right?
That's absolutely what I'm selling. I think the best way to think about HDR and the best way to use HDR is to, precisely as you've described, think about a hierarchy of highlights and have a differentiation between each category of highlight that you're employing. Now, the other thing I'll say is just because you can have a highlight doesn't mean you have to. If your intention is to have a dark room where the brightest thing in the room is just this very dim, diffuse white, then that's fine. Like, grade that. Screw HDR highlights. You don't need to have them. But the point of HDR is when it makes sense, when you want it, you can have it. It's another, to paraphrase a debate I had on Twitter somewhere along the line, it's a bigger box of crayons. Doesn't mean you have to use every single crayon in every single picture, but if you're doing a picture and you're like, wow, I would really love to have this rim of light behind her hair, that's just on fire, because that would be amazing. You can do it. And it is amazing. HDR is the most fun that I have had in years, as a colorist and as a filmmaker.
Most of the guests on the podcast happen to be colorists, hence the name of the podcast. So it's a rare opportunity to talk with a color timer. With very limited tools, Dale Grawn was able to change the emotion of a film without the luxury of immediate feedback. In this next section, he explains how he developed the looks for The Ring and Saving Private Ryan. Even when you were timing, you were asked to do something completely different than what was shot. I saw an interview where you were talking about The Ring, and you were talking about how you had to do something vastly different than what was shot. How are you able to do that with the limited tools you had as a color timer?
Well, that's where the skill comes in.
Yeah.
So what we do, or what I do, is I imagine what it's going to look like. I get a picture of what I want in my mind. And then I use the color tools that I have to get there. And when I find it, it's done. So I know where I'm going. And I know, I want this color blue. So this is too red. So I'm going to take red out of this in order to get that blue. So you have to imagine the color, and the color space and what you're going to create first. Then you move towards it to see whether it's going to work or not. And when you get there, if it works, everything looks right, then you made the right decision, you had the right vision. If not, then you're going to start over again. But most of the time, you're going to go the right direction. With The Ring, they wanted something. They actually asked me, they said, we want to look, but we don't want it to look like you made a look. So we don't want you to make it look like you tried to make a look. We just want you to make a look and just have it be a look. And so I said, well, all right, let's see. A scary story. The girl's in a well. So a traditional would be a cool blue. So that would be not so good. So I went from a cool blue to a greenish blue to try and bring, green has a little bit of evil sense to it. So I brought a little bit of green into the blue, made it kind of a teal color, and that worked. And I kept that color in those areas and then removed it when I wasn't in those areas. But I would also lead up to it. So in other words, if you're getting close to one of those areas, then it would start turning into that color before you got there. So it wouldn't be a big shock when you did get there.
And all of this you were able to envision in your mind. I think that for people who do color today, they don't realize is they can just push something around and immediately see the result. You had to actually think about what that was going to be and then wait and then have it printed and then it comes back.
Right. And you can't do that with people's negatives, because you run the risk every time you print it of breaking and scratching the negative. Plus it costs money to have a person do that. It's very expensive. So you couldn't guess incorrectly, is what I would have to tell you. But it all was guessing. You just had to be really good at guessing.
This is a perfect segue into the question I'm sure you're asked about all the time is Saving Private Ryan.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, it was.
That was another guy in England.
A different Dale Grahn.
No. Yeah, it was a different guy.
It's a huge milestone in color, and it really is the beginning of bleach bypass or silver retention or whatever you want to call it. And it was used in many films after that. But what I don't know if many people realize is that it started as a mistake.
Yeah, well, it was kind of a mistake. I'm assuming it was a mistake because we were processing all the film. We had a process called E&R. If you look it up, actually Vittorio Storaro was one who invented it with another guy, Ernesto. It's a contrast enhancement process. It goes through a developer and adds contrast by retaining more silver, right? So what we had to do with that, we had a 50 level, that's standard. When they were in England, they accidentally got the IR rating up to 100 one day, and it only affected a couple of shots. But when it did go to 100, it gave that bleach bypass look to it, right? And Steven saw those shots and said, wow, that looks great. Can we do that? You know, I'm working over here in America thinking that we're at 50, right? IR. And I'm putting everything at 50, and I can't match that color. I can't match that look. I've got too much saturation. My color is just too saturated, and I don't have a button for saturation, okay? So I went to my control guy and said, you know, I can't get this. I got too much saturation. I can't get it to work. Why is it not working? We're running the same as them. We're running 50 IR. I said, but it looks like I need to go higher. And he goes, well, I can get you to 100 if you want. I said, what? I was under the impression 50 was the highest. You know, 50 or 60 was the highest. I said, give me 100. And so we did it. We made a test that day at 100, and it matched exactly. So I matched the color correctly. I timed it as close as possible, but I just didn't have the 100 IR. So once I got the 100 IR, it matched identically. And then from that point on, I had to work with that 100 IR, which was very hard to work with. It doesn't move the same way that other film moves. It totally moves slower and doesn't react the same way to color. That's the same thing that happens when you desaturate an image today in digital and then you try to add color back to it. It doesn't work right.
Filmmaking is a collaborative process, and the colorist is a vital part of the visual team. Juan Cabrera has the opportunity to work with many directors and DPs and explains why it's so essential to have them in the room with you. You were talking, too, about when you were working at some of these other companies, you got the opportunity to work with really big-name directors. Do you feel like those people have shaped the way that you grade?
Here in the US, it's a completely different approach to the way it was in Europe. I feel like in here, it's mostly directors and producers who are saying what's what on the color grading room. I mean, sometimes the DP is invited to the color grading room. And for me, the first time that I saw that, I was like, what? I mean, it really did not get in my mind. In Europe, you work with the DP all the time. Most of the shows that I've done in Spain, the DP was sitting by my side through the whole process. You know, there is not like supervised versus unsupervised versions or anything like that. No, there's none of that. And having the DP in the room with me, it was not a hassle. It was a blessing. You know, it was amazing because at the end of the day, the DP is the person that has been talking about the look of the movie for the longest time. He has been talking with the director for the longest time. He has been involved with it. He knows what went on set. And when you're trying to grade a shot and there's something wrong on one shot to the next, and then if the DP is there, he can tell you, oh, you know what happened? I mean, we changed the take because this light was not working. So this light from here is not there anymore. And then you have an idea of what went on and why that's not working. At the same time as being able to work of having validation as you go, you know, or try crazy stuff together. In here, in the US, I've seen much more conflicts between DP and directors, like if they were doing two different type of movies. And that, to me, it's very interesting. So I would say that what has strengthened my skills as a colorist have been mostly working directly with DPs and being challenged by them, having to work with a more classic approach kind of DP who is, I wouldn't say afraid, but really afraid of color grading because it's so different from the film process and stuff. And he comes in very protective. And then having him leaving the session comfortable, happy, and excited about testing stuff, that's an amazing feeling, and it teaches you a lot about the craft of manipulating light. Because at the end of the day, we're both doing the same thing, just in two different stages, right? So I think it's DPs is what have working with different DPs and ended up having friendship with multiple DPs and helping them out in projects where they were having issues or not. That's what has taught me the most. With directors, you always have different directors. I have a director who's a very good friend of mine. We have done a lot of projects together, and he is what I call a magentaphobic. He hates magenta beyond anything else, and so it's like, so he had you learn to know the things that they like and the things that they react both positive and negative towards. And that definitely helps you as colorist and challenge you and all that stuff. But I feel like the approach is different from the kind of language and the kind of confidence that you can have with a DP.
One of my favorite shows from the past year had to be Planet Earth 2. Visually, it's an amazing show, and no small feat for colorist Adam Inglis. In this part, he talks about the challenges of working with nature footage and why it can be so compelling. So you've also done several projects too that draw on nature. They're obviously all lit with only natural light. And is there something different about how you use those projects? Because they're not deliberate. It's kind of like they just get what they get. And because you've worked on Planet Earth too, which I think is amazing, which is a great looking show, and really curious about how you approach that.
There's a couple of things there. Firstly, one of the very basic things you're doing with a show like that is you've got to make it all seamless. So you have, like I said, there's uncontrolled lighting, and so continuity is a lot more challenging than if someone's actually set the lights up correctly. So that's just hard work. And what I tend to do on those shows is I'll have a sort of a quick chat with a producer about what we're trying to do, and then they just have to leave me to it for a little bit as I just get it so that everything matches together. Because it's not just different light, there's different cameras. They're shooting like everything. They're shooting the Phantom, they're shooting Alexa, they're shooting F55, they're shooting old archive material. Everything is getting stuck together. So you've got to match all those as well. Once you've gone beyond that, then you're into the sense that a lot of this nature stuff is kind of very pure filmmaking. It's all about images and juxtaposing images to tell stories. There's not really the same way you might have with drama, which is about, actors and dialogue and that kind of thing. So it's about getting these pictures to have the impact to tell the story in a much further way. So I've found that we can often push this stuff a lot more than you might necessarily want to do in a regular drama, just because the sense of big, sweeping vistas and landscapes and stuff like that requires your brain wants to see a bit more there, if that makes sense. And also because you have no people in it, we can get away with a lot more because your brain is so sensitive to skin tone being off that you can immediately see if a grade looks weird by looking at the characters. But then in a wildlife film, we aren't as sensitive to what a cheetah looks like. We aren't as sensitive to what a parrot looks like. So you can kind of cook them up a little bit more. And to us, it just looks like better.
Yeah, the most brilliant thing, too, that I noticed in there was I felt myself treating these animals like characters. Like I'm yelling at the screen, you've got to run, lizard. You've got to get away from all these snakes. And you go, wait a second, these aren't actors. And so you're really injecting a lot of emotion into the whole situation, whether it's editorially or with the color or with the music, but on all front, when they all work together, you get this amazing result, and it's real.
Yeah, it's real filmmaking as well. That's how they're getting that emotional response is, not by sitting down and having planned out the scene. It's putting it together with using filmmaking techniques.
Broadcast television has some pretty tight deadlines, and Patrick Woodard is no stranger to that. He has some great insights on being flexible and working efficiently in television. So yeah, you've done a lot of television over the years, like you were saying, Weeds and Everybody Hates Chris and NCIS. So what are some of the challenges of working on these
big budget TV shows?
I'd say the primary challenge with episodic television is just the rapid pace at which it has to run at. So, basically I have to be very efficient with the time so that we can put as much as we can possibly put into every show and not compromise anything. So again, workflow plays a big part in that, making sure that that is as efficient as possible. And then from there, it really is, comes down to taste and refining your technique over time. Because you're on a tight schedule, at the end of the day, you don't want to compromise anything. So it's just getting in a rhythm that color is serving the story as best it can. I find that being the more unique challenge to television as a format versus, say, like a commercial or a feature film where, in my experience, I haven't got the quick turnaround. And the other common trend I'm seeing is the way that television is usually turned over for Final Color is like a lock is never really a true lock. So we're going through reconforms and, we're getting added elements throughout the process. And with the quick turnaround, you really just have to, exploit the technology so that the artistry can be at its max.
Color is already so subjective, but even more so when you're working in another country. Vanessa Taylor shares some of her advice when working with someone who doesn't even speak the same language.
You travel quite a bit as a colorist, and color can be really a subjective thing and even cultural. How do you deal with this when you're in other countries? And how do you deal with notes that may be lost in translation?
Well, I guess the biggest difference between countries is the weather. At its most basic, hot countries connect with warmer colours, cold countries expect cooler tones. This is sometimes used within a country to distinguish warmer and colder regions. I work in Turkey a lot, and I use this technique to distinguish between the cities of the north and the beaches of the south. When, telling a story which is set in both parts, you can instantly tell the viewer where you are. This is particularly useful if your timeline is non-linear in time, which is becoming more popular lately, actually. I'm not so worried about cultural meanings to colours, as this is addressed usually by the set design and costume design. I'm not doing a lot of commercial work, so I'm not, reinventing, completely changing colours. But I am interested in this type of thing. For example, green and its association with Islam. The Quran represents green as paradise, which is, I'm guessing, probably why most of the Islamic countries have flags with this green. But it's also a symbol of new life, nature, and growth in all cultures. Green's particularly interesting, actually, because it's got a bit of a split personality. It's also got connections to death and decay. And in the movies, it's always the poison, the colour of poison.
The witch is green.
Exactly. And with notes being lost in translation, I think you find a common language with the pictures. If you do your research and understand the story, then you're both looking at the same thing. If I work on a foreign film and I have the story, I always make sure I have the story told to me before I start, and I'll constantly ask questions through the grade. Usually the DOP or director can just point at an area where he or she has a note, and I'll see what they mean.